Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. So for anyone that has any sense of what's going on in the world today will be aware of the appalling and tragic events happening in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. And I feel that it's really important that we try to dissect what's going on, that we do what we can to help the people of Ukraine, also the Jewish community of Ukraine, and to understand and make sense of what's going on and what could be to come and what needs to be done in order to resolve this. So you've seen, I hope, many videos that we've produced with the historian and lecturer Ian Lucas, and I'm really pleased to say that he's joining us now because we've been having so many conversations off camera about what's happening in Ukraine, also with regard to how Israel's dealing with the relations with both Ukraine and Russia, what they are doing, what they perhaps should be doing. And I thought that it'd be really worthwhile to actually have a discussion on air with Ian, given his depth of knowledge. He spent a huge amount of time living in Israel, teaching there and studying. And I think talking to a student of history is incredibly important when trying to make sense of what is to come. So Ian, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. And I really just want to jump straight in to assessing this situation. First of all, we'll talk specifics and then maybe go into the question of Israel's angle and what role Israel might be able to play, given that this is JTV. Let's talk about Putin for a second. What is motivating this man?
Nobody knows, other than looking back at it. As an historian, I can only look backwards, not forwards. That's what we as historians do. And there is no doubt that Putin has shown, not 12 days ago and not 6 months ago, but probably 20 years ago, all the attributes, in inverted commas, of a totalitarian dictator, autocrat. People have forgotten, and it's, I'm angry at the moment. I am very, very angry with everyone. I'm always angry. People say I'm always angry, but I'm particularly angry, right, at everything around, because Putin grew up as a KGB agent in the days of the Cold War and Soviet power, behind the Iron Curtain, when there were two distinct camps in history. There was the American sphere of influence, and there was the Russian sphere of influence, the Soviet sphere of influence. Suddenly, and not undefinably, for want of a better word, the Soviet Union collapsed and became a very, very weak country, never mind a world power. The oligarchs had got hold of all the resources, and you just have to look around where they're flying their private planes, by the way. 9 of the private planes of the oligarchs flew directly to Israel for safekeeping. Bear that in mind when we talk a little bit later. So for Putin, his whole raison d'etre, in my estimation, I'm not a psychologist or a psychoanalyst, and historians don't go down that road. The one thing I do go down is when an autocrat or a totalitarian maniac says he's going to do something, we should listen very carefully. Because when Hitler said what he was going to do, no one believed him. Then he went and he did exactly what he said he was going to do. Putin said what he was going to do to Ukraine, and he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do. So when the head of NATO, the night before all this conflagration, all this war, and it's nothing short of a war, by the way, began, he had the audacity to stand up at a press conference and say he didn't know Putin was going to go to war. The head of NATO. So let's be very clear here. History doesn't repeat itself. I'm not one of those historians who believes that. What I do believe is that it plays very similar music. And the music of 80 years ago is being played very loudly. So when us as Jews, and particularly here within JTV, we can talk within that kind of framework to a certain extent, look at what's happening, and some of the justification for doing nothing is, well, the Ukrainians were really bad anti-Semites. And in their history, they've killed more Jews than the Russians. And it's in our interest to do something else as opposed to our morality. And this is where my first real point becomes critical. You cannot distinguish in this conflagration between what's in Israel's best interest and what is the moral thing to do, for two reasons. There's a cliche in Hebrew that's being used the whole time to describe this, that Israel's been walking holchim ben hatipot, lalechet ben hatipot, which means to walk between the raindrops. And in our translation, it'd probably be to tiptoe on eggshells. Now, it's all well and good to talk about tiptoeing through the raindrops, and what's the Israeli stand up until yesterday, by the way, was exactly that. Why? Because Israel's war with Iran, which has been going on for 2 years, and let's be very clear here, Israel is at war with Iran. And every night, almost, for the last 2 years, Israel has been bombing the convoys in Syria, going from Iran to Lebanon to Hezbollah to provide them with GPS units, with sophisticated missiles. And let's be clear again, there are 100,000 missiles in northern Israel, inverted commas, Lebanon basically, in Hezbollah's hands, pointed at Israel, and not just at northern Israel, anyway. So to say that it's in Israel's interest to walk between the raindrops is nonsense. Israel's main interest is the United States of America. Without American aid, Israel faces huge problems. And the most outstanding one is the Iron Dome. Without American aid and know-how as well, although it was produced with Israeli and American know-how together, last May, and let me remind people what happened on the 11th of May, 2021, when rockets were fired from Gaza onto Tel Aviv, not just into Sderot and all the southern settlements. What saved Israel, literally saved Israel, was the Iron Dome. So to say that Israel's interest is to sit somewhere between, or on the fence between America and Russia, is nonsense. That's number one. Number two, the morality issue is not negated or in tension with the interest issue.
Well, hold on, Ian. Can I ask, what would you say? What would you say to someone that says, "Well, hold on a second, fully understand that there's a moral duty to stand with the people of Ukraine, but if they were to say, we jeopardize the security and safety of our own people if we aren't able to target these areas in Syria, which we could only do with permission of Russia." So they might say it's not morality versus interest, it's morality versus morality.
Okay, I don't buy that.
Okay.
Because if you can't justify what you're doing on a moral issue, on a moral ground, and I don't believe the end justifies the means, I'm sorry. And that's maybe where I will differ with a lot of people who would ask that question. That's why I couldn't be, for example, an assassin in the Mossad, because I couldn't kill people. They wouldn't take people like me. You need someone who believes that you can do that. And the people who do, the people who can't. So, it's a human kind of trait, if you like. But the big question you ask is, where does our survival clash with morality? So, over the years, I've had many debates with many greater historians than I would ever be, who accused the United Kingdom, England in those days, of being complicit in not bombing the death camps, not bombing Auschwitz, when they could have. And they bombed not far from Auschwitz, by the way, as people know, and some stray bombs landed on Auschwitz. So the argument always was, they could have bombed British bombers and American bombers could very easily have bombed Auschwitz, but they didn't. And the justification was we didn't want to waste, strategic bombs that would bring the war to an end sooner, and then less Jews would be killed. That was always the argument. I don't buy that argument. And the same way as today, I don't buy that argument. So I think what's shown yesterday, 2 days before, Israel has become involved. So Israel's got off the fence. And the second argument related to that was maybe we can do more good by being an interloper between Russia and the Ukraine because we've got good relations with both.
So I was about to ask that. What do you think Israel could do as a potential moderator? Could they even be a moderator? What do you see happening?
Today, Naftali Bennett, who has a party which has 6 seats in the Knesset, who became prime minister because of a whole lot of internal shenanigans, for want of a better word, became prime minister. And he, by the way, is more right-wing than Netanyahu would ever be. Suddenly, without any personal chemistry. Now, I'm, as an historian, a great believer that leaders need to have personal chemistry between in order to get things done. If you don't like someone, you become very suspicious of them. And that's why Netanyahu's sort of break with the Democratic Party with Obama was such a serious issue when he went and spoke directly to the House of Congress and bypassed the White House. And when Bennett went to meet Joe Biden for the first time, everybody was looking at their watches. All the journalists outside. While he went to the White House, he was supposed to meet there for 30 minutes. And after 55 minutes, they're still looking at their watches. Everyone's happy because they must be getting on and everybody's friends. Okay? But to be a go-between in a war, you need to have a plan, and you need to have standing, and you need to be someone who has influence. So, for example, Kissinger, people who remember the 73 war, will remember the negotiations between Egypt and Israel at kilometer 101, was kilometer 101 from Cairo. Kissinger was a go-between. Why? Because he had a plan. He arrived, he said, right, this is what the negotiations are about. Here's the plan. Go away, think about it, and tell me what you're going to come back with, to both sides. What's Bennett having to do? Bennett's going there and saying, okay, first of all, it got signed off by the Americans, by the way. He wouldn't have been going there if the Americans had not said, go and speak to Putin and see what can happen. Okay? So he goes there and he says, right, what do you want? And Putin says, well, I'll tell you exactly what I want. Ukraine is going to become part of Russia in some shape, especially the eastern, not only the eastern side, and understand that NATO is a serious threat to Russia. And this is where it goes back to his KGB days, the days of Soviet power. Remember, there was the Warsaw Pact and there was NATO. NATO was set up as a peacekeeping kind of organization, not a war-going-to organization. And that's why it's so powerless at the moment. We'll do everything except have a no-fly area, a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And he doesn't care as an individual. That's already been shown. So you've got this combination here of totalitarianism, individual, and the world. So what do? We wring our hands, and the Houses of Parliament give him a standing ovation, President Zelensky, and he's the first foreign leader ever to talk directly to Parliament, and someone even nominates him for an honorary knighthood. That's what we can do. It's nonsense. If you ask me, what can we do as a result of what I see in history, and this is why I'm angry, and this is why I'm this madman that people will always call me, right? There's only one thing that we can do, and that is call the bluff. What's the bluff? The bluff is nuclear annihilation of this planet. That's what NATO are afraid of. That if they send up planes and Ukrainian pilots take these MiGs that the Poles have offered them, the Poles have offered the Ukrainian Air Force 29 MiG-29. I mean, that's also the irony of it, right? That to all intents and purposes, Ukraine arms and its training and its pilots were all trained by Russians. But if a MiG flown by a Ukrainian pilot, not a NATO pilot, shoots down a Russian plane, he is threatened to unleash his nuclear units that he put on standby. Now, it's a scary, the world has never been here before. Even in 1962, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, for the people like your parents, maybe your parents were even too young, but I remember it very well. The world thought that there was going to be a nuclear war because the Russians were putting missiles on Cuba. And Kennedy stopped it. Now, here comes another real crunch in this whole debate. So Putin says to Bennett, you go and tell your American friends. In 1962, Kennedy went berserk and almost went to war and made Khrushchev turn his boats around because he wouldn't have missiles on Cuba. So what's the difference with you putting missiles into Poland? How do you want me to live with that? And you talk about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO? And you want other countries to become democratic? You can see where this is going. His demands are unacceptable to Zelensky, who wants to be a Western-facing liberal democracy. That's what he wants Ukraine.
Okay, there's a lot you've said here to unpack. I mean, first of all, let's just go back to Putin for a second. Putin, you said he's an autocratic madman, but then you're also talking about, well, but look at, he's seeing NATO, he's seeing these liberal democratic countries around him, and he's saying, well, I consider this a threat. But realistically, rationally, why should he see NATO have it very clear what they're about? They just don't, they want to stop Russian expansionism. So why should he believe that why should he see them as a threat in any way, or see democracies around him as a threat?
They're a serious threat.
Why?
Because he's not democratic. Because the Russian population will look around and see a place like Ukraine or Moldova, or Romania, where people have freedom of speech and don't get threatened with going to jail for 15 years. Remember another thing, by the way, which I should have mentioned. The power of social media in this conflict is as it's never been seen before. And the propaganda. There was one quick clip of someone in Ukraine phoning her family in Russia and telling them what they were going through. And the Russian part of the phone was telling you, talking nonsense, propaganda. We know it's not a war. What are you talking about?
Crazy. And then you spoke about Israel. So it sounds like you don't think Israel can play a role as a mediator.
I think it can. I didn't say that. I said there's got to be a plan somewhere, right? The Americans have got to come up with a plan. Nobody else. This is between America saying to Russia, we have to live together. Remember, the Chinese here are playing a very big role quietly. Initially they supported supported Russia. Then they voted with the UN condemning the raid, which is meaningless. And now they're saying, well, it's a humanitarian issue. But meanwhile, the Chinese are eyeing Taiwan, drooling at the mouth. This is Taiwan is a Ukrainian waiting kind of thing. But my concern is that the plan that the West wants for Eastern Europe, in inverted commas, what was Eastern Europe, is totally unacceptable to Putin. Now, the question really is it just one man driving this, one autocrat, maniac, whatever, or has he built around him the yes people, the generals who will just do what he says? But I think there needs to be a plan, and then Israel maybe can be, the go-between.
I want to finally ask, just because we're short on time, how do you think this is going to materialize? And do you think, okay, so we haven't gone to war with Russia, the rest of the world hasn't, but there's a huge amount of pressure by corporations, by governments in terms of sanctions, which I think is it's good to see a lot of unity happening around this. Are we doing anything different to how we dealt with brutal dictators in the past. Where do you see this going?
Yeah, that's very important, because that's basically the crunch of what this whole thing's about. Sanctions can only work in the long term. They don't work overnight. So when we talk about not being dependent on Russian oil and gas by the end of 2022, how many people could be dead by then? Remember, this is about families like your family and my family. 2 weeks ago, sitting down watching television, the next day, the mother and 2 children are saying goodbye to the father, who they might never see again, and probably will never see again, because no males between the ages of 16 and 65 are allowed to leave the country. So you would have to stay while your family leaves, and they might not ever see you again. That's the first thing that people need to bear in mind about sanctions. It's long term. What are we doing about tomorrow? The other thing is, do you know, well, I read a statistic yesterday that really made me even more angry than I was angry. Do you know what the UK, Europe, and the US are paying the Russians daily, every day, including the last 12 days, for energy?
I think we discussed this, right? Was it like
$700 million a day. Now, where I think can all fall apart, and hopefully will fall apart, is that the Russian people will start feeling the crunch. And they'll be accused, like in the days of the Soviet regime, when you stood in a queue for 5 hours to get a loaf of bread, and then there were only 3 left when you got there. That kind of thing. But that's the long term. And I think it's important. You know, the fact that McDonald's and Starbucks have to take 12 days to decide to stop selling their goods in Russia is beyond anger. So, and also, we carry on as if it's not going to affect us. It's affecting the whole world. When the price of wheat goes through the ceiling, because Egypt, for example, and here's a note that can really make people understand the crisis that we're all in. 85% of Egyptian wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine. 80%, between 80 and 85%, which means that when people have to buy bread, and bread prices go through the ceiling from Cairo to Johannesburg to wherever, which they will do, people take to the streets. Riots will break out in Cairo and wherever, and Moscow. So my hope, in a sense, NATO is going to call the bluff. I don't believe he is that mad that he would unleash a nuclear. And then everything slows down. Winter comes, by the way, on the last note. This is almost like Napoleon and Hitler and Putin in history. It's going to be. They're talking about temperatures next week of minus 10 to 20 degrees. And they talk about how that's going to affect the army columns. You know, there's a 64-kilometer column on a road heading towards Kiev with people sitting in tanks, which will turn into freezers, metal freezers at minus 20 degrees.
Yeah.
You know, it could be the same kind of music playing. They get caught in a winter. But no one's talking about what's happening to the refugees trying to get there. But that's my hope.
Okay.
But as I say, I'm angry, and I think everybody, and particularly the Jewish community, should be angry.
Yeah. Well, Ian, thank you so much for a really huge amount of insight there in a very short amount of time. I hope for you that this will, as you say, that this will resolve soon. And thank you for the update. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.